Good morning. My name is Roberta Bonazzi. I'm the president of the European Foundation for Democracy. I'm delighted to welcome you to this media briefing, press conference. At a time when the situation is so incredibly complex in a very important region like the Arabian Peninsula, we felt it is important to bring experts and input in the debate with expert knowledge, particularly coming from the region. On behalf of the European Foundation for Democracy, and in partnership with Trends Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi, we've discussed the opportunity of organizing this series of briefings and exchange of views with experts, policymakers, and key stakeholders in Brussels and across Europe. Today we're very pleased to be able to share with you our views, our expertise, the work that we do, and I'm very pleased to have with me Dr. Richard Burchell from Trends Research and Advisory. I will hand over to Dr. Burchell to give an overview of his perspective, coming from the region, working in the region, understanding the dynamics, so that in order to shed light of what this crisis actually means, both for the region and for Europe.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roberta. Thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. I'm Dr. Richard Burchell, the Director of Research at Trends Research and Advisory, a privately owned think tank and consultancy service based in Abu Dhabi. We want to thank EFD and Roberta and her staff for all their assistance in bringing this event together. Not only is it important for the current situation involving Qatar to be talked about in the region, but we need to talk about it in Europe because all of us are essentially in this together. The primary focus for Trends on the current situation is the issue of funding and material support for terrorism and extremism. Unfortunately, you would think I don't need to explain why addressing terrorism and extremism is so important in today's world. Europe has experienced too many terrorist attacks over the last 18 months to 2 years. The region, unfortunately, is becoming almost a day-to-day issue. But yet, we're finding international cooperation, constructive cooperation, is lacking on this issue. The current situation involving Qatar is thus the primary problem. We have an independent sovereign state that is actively supporting terrorism and extremism. And this isn't a new issue either. This dates back to early 2000. In 2013, 2014, states in the region met with the leadership of Qatar. They agreed to matters where they would cooperate in minimizing, lessening the direct support for funding and extremism. Qatar, in line with its foreign policy since 2000, if not before, chose to go its own path. And this is the biggest difficult issue we're facing. A state that is able to assert and exert influence over others through funding, through material support, is choosing to go against the global regime for countering terrorism and stop supporting extremism. Now, the global regime that I'm speaking of is the UN Security Council's counterterrorism sanctions regime, the identification of extremist groups and individuals. These individuals are put on sanctions lists. Member states of the UN are required to take action. Qatar has chosen not to take any action against named individuals. And this is not due to an absence of evidence. One only needs to go on the Interpol database, the UN's database, the EU's database, the US database, and you can find this information. So this is out in the open, it's out in the public. For a state to openly refuse to cooperate, and we've seen the leadership speak on Western news channels saying, we will decide who the terrorist is, we won't listen to others. They have a terrorist designation list in Qatar that has nobody's name on it. We have a real issue here. This is a real problem. If we add to that the extent to which extremist views are able to openly and publicly be stated through media channels It is very problematic. And this is where it becomes a real concern for Europe. We have individuals that are essentially speaking about the dominance of political Islam, the need for the caliphate to return to Europe, speaking very anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and racist views about Israel and other states, and they are allowed to transmit across Europe. This is a real problem for European countries. As we know, the ideology of extremism is a problem that needs to be addressed, not just here in Belgium, but across Europe and the West. So everybody has a stake in this. Qatar's behavior is, as I said, is completely outside the global norms. It's outside the global trends, and there's no real explanation for it either. Individual states can choose their own foreign policy. That's not in question, but we're not talking about foreign policy in this case. We're talking about direct and active support for terrorism. US officials have spoken out against this on a regular basis. It is time now that Europe speaks out against it, and in the region, the current actions being taken against Qatar are for the purpose of demonstrating to the world that this is a problem and action needs to be taken. Qatar needs to change its behavior. So in the context of this morning, we are happy to take questions on this situation, and we're at your disposal. No problem. I mean, the question was on what has been the impact of the measures taken against Qatar. Now, this is a great question because we're seeing a variety of different assessments being given. On the one hand, we have Qatari officials traveling throughout the West saying there's a massive humanitarian crisis, that they're being denied basic freedoms. But on the other hand, we have the Qatari leadership saying we haven't noticed, nothing has happened, there's been no impact. Now, when states take diplomatic or economic actions against another state to try to influence, to change its behavior, it is up to, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, as to whether or not they are effective. The United States had a complete embargo on Cuba for over 40 years. The regime never changed. The United States said it was purely effective. Cuba says it wasn't effective. We would have to do some sort of empirical assessment on that. But the whole purpose is not looking at, are the measures effective or not? The purpose of the measures is to bring to light, to the public discussion, a particular issue and concern. We will always have people saying the measures are being damaging. Others will say, no, they're not being damaging. Again, I'll refer you to the current dispute between the EU and Russia. EU says they're having a major impact with the measures they're taking on Russia. Russia's saying no impact whatsoever. But the idea is that to continually put diplomatic pressure upon another state, asking it to change its behavior. So when you're assessing, are they effective, have they worked or not, a lot of it depends on where you sit. At the very least, what we're having is public debate and discussion. Qatar is at the table, it is talking to the US, it's talking to Kuwait, who's mediating, so they are engaging in the discussion at the very least. If we can get Qatar to even acknowledge that it is and has been supporting terrorism and extremism, that would be a major impact on the situation. So at the very least, we're having the public debate, the pressure is on, these things take time, we'll have to wait and see. The USA position on the Qatar situation, I think, is emblematic of the USA position on its foreign policy under its current presidency. We're getting differing statements, differing views from differing US institutions. So I'm not sure if there's 2, 3, maybe 4 positions that are out there right now. Yes, this is not helpful. It is a problem. There's also another problem with the US is that they have 3, 4, I think almost 5 now, different regimes for dealing with support and funding of terrorism as well. What the US leadership needs to do is provide some coherent leadership, a single voice addressing the issue. Obviously, the USA is a major player in the region. Their lack of consistency on this is not helping anybody. But again, I would say that's not confined to the current situation. That's part of wider global affairs at the moment. And in that regard, and I'll let Roberta speak on this a bit more, one of the reasons we see Europe as a major player in this is that Europe can provide a clear and much more coherent approach to providing leadership and support to assist the states instead of providing differing political positions that different states can act upon and seize upon for their own benefit.
I would like to add that in addition to the position of the United States, it's a high time for Europe, for its member states, the European institutions and leadership to play a much more decisive and clear role when it comes to prevention of radicalization, and all those countries and organizations and networks that are actually contributing to the promotion and support of the ideology. Brussels has witnessed strong, powerful, destructive attacks very recently. Many more have been foiled. What we see in Brussels and in a large number of European countries is how structures directly linked to Qatar are continually continue to play an active role in supporting the spread of the ideology.
And I mean, just add to that in the U.S. position, a lot's being made out of the U.S. Air Base in Qatar on how essentially that provides Qatar with a bargaining chip or a stick. But I'd refer you to statements from individuals like former Secretary of Defense Bill Gates, who pointed out at an event in Washington, D.C. that no airbase is sacred. You can move them, it can change, it is not the ultimate bargaining chip. I think, as I said earlier, what we need to do is try to find out where the U.S. stands on issues like this. Obviously, fighting terrorism and extremism is a key issue for the U.S. The U.S. has, for a long time, said Al-Qaeda is the most dangerous threat to American security in the world. So for the U.S. to continue to cooperate or support in any way a country that is directly supporting Al-Qaeda in terms of terrorist funding raises some serious question marks about the U.S.'s own foreign policy. But a move towards coherence would help, along partnering with Europe and others, would be beneficial to the region.
I would start as a top priority, much better and thorough scrutiny of European funding and national funding that goes to supporting organizations that are linked to the ideology, that are linked to groups that are simultaneously being funded by sources from Qatar. There is a paradox on how European decision makers, policy makers are actually partnering with organizations that appear to be sharing the values and the principles of liberal democracies and on which the European Union is funded, but in fact are driven by an ideology.
And if I can add to that, for the region's perspective, we're looking for more engagement from European institutions generally. What we're seeing now are individual member states who have a vested interest or a historical position in the region coming out individually, and we might have 3 or 4 more positions to add to the already confused mix of leadership. One of the things we've been arguing about and sort of discussing is Europe bringing to bear its experiences of states working together to confront common threats to security. European institutions were built upon this. We had states that fought wars against each other. In the 70s, we had states that were ideologically on completely different poles. And European institutions have been able to, not perfectly, but they've been able to bring people to the table to discuss issues of common concern. Europe needs to bring that experience to the region, to get people to sit down at the table and talk to each other. Plus, the European institutions are strongly based on rule of law and international security. So the importance of focusing on legal obligations in international law could be reinforced. The USA, as we all know, is not a great example of this either, adhering to international standards and cooperating in global institutions. So the European Union is an honest player in many respects. It could actually bring this influence to the region. It doesn't have any vested interests. It can't be accused of picking political positions in any way. And it would actually probably bring a bit of moderation and mature behavior to the ongoing debate. And as I said, just the support of experience would be very beneficial to the region as well. I mean, we're here not to tell anybody anything or tell anybody to do anything. We're here to discuss the issue, to find out how best we can move forward and finding solutions to it. The particular matter at the stage right now is direct state funding and support for terrorist and extremist organizations, based on evidence that has been gathered by international institutions and individual states. On this record, Qatar does stand out amongst many other states. We have, in comparison, and there's been reports and studies done on this, other states in the GCC, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have a long list of mutual legal assistance requests to the United States and to Interpol. Qatar is 0. Now that alone suggests that those states are working on it, they are making the effort, they are cooperating globally, whereas the evidence on Qatar is it is making no effort to cooperate with anybody. And that's the big issue, and that's the key issue. Now, we can put in saying there are other influences, there are other issues of support going on, and that's something the world does need to address and look at. But what we're particularly looking at is the current international legal position on direct state funding and support, and the evidence on Qatar is extensive. For anybody who's interested, Trends has put together some briefing documents on this. If you provide me with your cards afterwards, I'll be happy to email them to you to provide some more detailed evidence on this issue. Well, I mean, ideally, that's what we want. We want people to sit in the room and talk about the issues and come to some conclusions on this. Now, again, I think part of the region, part of the frustration for the states in the region is Qatar's history on this. As you said, 2013-14, they did sit around a table. We did have an agreement. Wasn't followed up upon. Going back to your earlier question, can we get the U.S. leadership, get some leadership to get people to sit down? Yeah, that would be the ideal situation. Now, the states currently taking measures against Qatar have made it clear there will be no escalation in terms of military, which again is contrary to international law. But you can add more and more countermeasures. It can be in the form of targeted, specific sanctions. Because right now, all we have are the states boycotting. There is no siege, there is no blockade, there are no sanctions directly administered towards Qatar by another government. You have other states saying, we don't wish to cooperate with you. We don't wish to trade with you. And that is a sovereign right upon all states. You can't tell somebody you must trade with me if I want you to trade with me. So there are a lot of other opportunities available. Targeted sanctions that can list both individuals and regimes, following the European and the US models. That might happen. You can start listing other possibilities and activities in the diplomatic sphere. But I think at the point now is we have it out in the open, we have it in the public, we know what needs to be discussed. It is now up to Qatar to come to the table, as you said, sit down, have a discussion, and work out solutions that are amenable to all parties. I mean, on the first point, what is the future of the GCC? Again, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, the GCC structure is very much unlike Europe's. It's at the basic structure. It does have a Supreme Council body that works on consensus only. So you need all member states to be sitting at the table to have any discussion about the future of the GCC. The idea, the belief, personally, you want to see the GCC continue. You want to see the GCC to be able to be a forum where the member states can come together, discuss issues of common concern, and work out practical responses. This is where I think the European institutions can bring their experience to bear, not as a replacement to Kuwait's mediation efforts, or even the US's mediation efforts, but in conjunction with. Because we need to find not just a resolution to the current situation, we need to look at this long term. We need to put structures and institutions in place that will last, that will provide the support necessary to address the particular issues at stake right now. So in that regard, we want to see a GCC that is unified, but also has particular oversight, monitoring, information gathering structures in place that the member states can utilize to work together on the issue. So hopefully we won't see the end of the GCC, but we'll see a strengthened GCC out of this. And again, that goes back to our point where we think Europe could provide a lot of lessons on this. The mediation efforts, as I said, appear to be working. We have people talking. It is being discussed. But these things do take time. Well, I mean, for our purposes in looking at the funding of support of terrorism and extremism, Qatar just needs to adhere to international standards. I mean, and that's not an optional negotiating exercise. That is a requirement under the UN Charter. Now, I know we don't believe in international institutions when they don't work, but at the same time, that's what we need to do. All states need to ensure that they do not directly fund and support terrorist organizations. They do not provide permissive jurisdictions in which those terrorist organizations can come and raise funds. And states need to ensure that their banking systems are not abused for that purpose. So Qatar just needs to take measures that brings it in line with international standards. They need to meet the U.S. Treasury Department standards on terrorist funding and money laundering. They need to adhere to the UN Security Council sanctions regime on funding and support of terrorists. That's, in many respects, that's not really up for negotiation because no state in the world can say, well, we don't want to do that. It is a requirement upon states. At the very least, yeah, we need to see Qatar adhere to this, and then that will ensure that its neighbors are more satisfied with its behavior and more confident that going forward, these activities will either be finished or we'll at least know they're happening. So I think for the states in the region, I can't speak on behalf of anybody, that would be a long way to building confidence, because a lot of this is rebuilding confidence in Qatar's ability to cooperate and work with others. Yeah, for now. I mean, you just can't impose measures for an objective and pull them away saying, all right, we give up. No. The evidence is out there. The position is relatively clear. And I think, yes, the measures need to stay in place. I'm not sure how politicians can take that position because you do need to engage in some form of negotiation. All sides do. We're seeing elements of negotiation. We're seeing variations in how the positionings are pursued. If Qatar is going to be insistent that it's not going to negotiate, then yeah, it's imperative upon the other major powers in the world to put the pressure on Qatar saying you have to negotiate. You do have to work with others. We cannot have a single state determining its own foreign policy to the detriment of global peace and security. Yeah, there's evidence going back to Al-Qaeda. There are individual Qataris and individuals working in Qatar using the Qatari banking system, and in some cases using the government set up charity system to funnel money to Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, Yemen, Syria. Yeah, Nusra Front was seen and regularly known to be in Doha, so the evidence is there. And I said the evidence is clear. The U.S. has the evidence, Interpol has the evidence, and I'll provide you with what we've gathered from open source information. I mean, on that regard, the extent to which the United Nations regime will take actions against an individual state, you're right, we won't see any particular action being taken formally because that's the nature of the global system. And there is no provision in the current Security Council resolution regime where you can actually do that. At the same time, individual states can continue to put the pressure on Qatar that you do need to stop doing this, you do need to take the action, and that can have, again, further diplomatic and economic consequences upon the state. But as I said, the whole purpose of this discussion, of the whole discussion, is that we are openly talking about it now. We can identify the sources, we can find who's responsible, and we can start getting states to take action on it. Absolutely right. I mean, this is a problem for the world, and more action needs to be done by all actors in this regard. And this is a good opportunity for us to keep the pressure on about the funding of terrorism and extremism, and hopefully, over time, start to see some real action in this regard.
And I would like to add on this that precisely because the debate is open and there's a lot more awareness and understanding of what is going on, it is critical that also on the European side there are firmer decisions made and actions taken in respect to countries that are funding directly organizations that contribute to the to radicalization processes. And there is enough evidence, so it is no longer acceptable that Europe, that decision makers, that public authorities don't take any actions and ignore the problem.
I mean, again, in the way we need to be clear, and I do apologize if it's overly legalistic, there are two different things there. When a state engages in permitting funding or directly funding, that is an issue of international law. And that is, we are able to identify direct state responsibility. Now, when funding comes through charitable organizations, you want to make sure that at the very least, the states have in place oversight. And I'll give you the example. Saudi Arabia has a single charitable foundation upon which all external money has to go through. Therefore, the U.S. Treasury Department, and I'm not sure if the European Union is part of it, it can be monitored. It is monitored. Now, when that money arrives overseas, now I don't think there's any direct funding of terrorist activity, but more extremist activity. That's not up to the originating state to determine how individuals and former citizens or citizens of his country operate in a different jurisdiction. That's up to the European jurisdiction to ask questions. What is the money being used for? Who have you hired in this mosque? What are your educational materials? But yet European states seem very reluctant to do that. So that's a European problem on the ground, to be looking at what is actually going on with this money. And we have legal cases where they've been able to identify the flow of money from extremists to terrorists, and that can be done through the legal sense. But again, you can't ask states to regulate the behavior of their citizens abroad. If the money's coming out of a jurisdiction, it can be monitored, it can be looked at, it can be kept track of. How that money's utilized on the ground in another jurisdiction is the necessity of mutual legal assistance and cooperation, but yet the imperative or the impetus is upon the state where the activities are being carried out.
I think what we've seen in Europe, I would say that is a very well-structured and sophisticated network of organizations that are not always directly, cannot always be directly tracked back to one entity. What you have is a thick, complex web of connections, sometimes often family connections, financial connections, and organizational connections that are certainly difficult to identify or to bring to light. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot more goodwill on the side of European governments in understanding what is the ideology that lays behind most of this, this concept, this network, the Muslim Brotherhood as such, and the fact that the ideological structure of these of the Muslim Brotherhood, of political Islam, of Islamist organizations, is exactly the same that leads to radicalization, and that represents the structure, the base of what have become terrorist organizations. We talk about ISIS. We just need to go one step ahead, one step beyond ISIS, and look at what is the ideological framework that keeps it alive and led it to become what it is today.
And I think, from what I've seen, the reports that are coming out of Europe are useful. Now, as Roberta said, we're looking at a loose organization, so can we identify a single legal person, corporate entity that holds overarching responsibility for all of these activities? No, that's difficult to do. However, in Europe, the US, and in the Gulf region, different political parties and organizations have been identified and have been banned as terrorist organizations. For Europe, what I think we need to bring to light even more is, as Roberta said, is the ideological issue. The proponents of political Islam are not saying, oh, we're here to bring more recognition of Islam in society. What they're saying is the world must submit to Islam as the only authority here on earth. So they're rejecting the domestic constitutional systems upon which Europe is based. That's very dangerous. That creates divides in society. It creates intolerance. And on that level alone, these groups need to be questioned. In Europe, we do not have absolute free speech, and that is seen as a European value. Free speech cannot be damaging, cannot be insulting, cannot incite racial, ethnic, xenophobic, or any other hatred. But yet these organizations are putting forth an ideology that is saying to individuals, you have an obligation to reject everything in this society. And they're abusing the ability to be free and open in Europe to call for the end of freedom in Europe. And I'll point, there's a great link to this where Yusuf al-Qaradawi was on Al Jazeera making this very point, saying freedom only means the freedom to choose Islamic law as the only authority in society. So when Europe has freedom, Europe will do this. And that's damaging. It creates hatred in society, and that part needs to be addressed. So the UK report did bring out that we need to be very careful about the ideology these organizations are putting forth, because they are damaging to society. They're very contrary to European values. They're not in sort of indicative of European values, they are contrary to it, and that point needs to be addressed.
European governments, European decision makers for too long have been too naive, either in relying on what was being said by preachers or so-called religious leaders, but also in believing that Europe would need fatwas or religious decisions to endorse their policies. Forgetting that Europe is based on very strong, very solid principles and values, and this what counts. Certainly Europe and European leaders have made big mistakes trying to play and understand or appease, if you want, Muslim representatives, and erroneously believing that they were also obtaining support from the Arab world to carry out their policy, foreign policy decisions. And I would say there's been a lot of, today we're in a very different situation. There's a much better dialogue between Europe, America, and the Arab and Muslim world compared to what it was 10 years ago. And all parties have played on very ambiguous positions. So the answer is it doesn't matter what has been done, what Europe has done or thought it was doing right. What counts is the rule of law, the fundamental values and principles on which Europe is based, and the fact that it is unacceptable and inadmissible for an ideology that, as Richard said, is a very divisive ideology to be allowed to spread and supported in Europe.
And I mean, your point on that individual circumstance, again, relates to the overall current situation with Qatar. We can provide an example, or maybe two examples, where their behavior is, I don't know if you want to call it favorable or not, but if you call it favorable. But what we need to do is not just pick one anecdotal example and say, oh, well, they're fine, don't worry about them. We need to look at behavior over an extended period of time and start adding up the evidence. So again, to go back to the issue of Qaradawi on Al Jazeera, all right, fine, he may have provided something that, again, I don't agree that it was favorable or even necessary, as Roberta said, but let's look at his other behavior, the sort of speech that comes out of his mouth about hatred for Jews, about some of the speech and glorification of violence and other activities that comes out. We need to make an overall assessment. Yes, individuals, particular parties may provide a contrary position once in a while, but let's not judge them on that. Let's look at the bigger picture and come up to a much more holistic assessment. Because the same thing's happening with Qatar. People are saying, no, Qatar is engaged, going back to your earlier question, in the global coalition to fight against terrorism. All right, if you fly a couple air sorties, does that mean you're actually engaged, or you are doing it for show? And that's the big question we actually have to ask.
Well, I think we can say that in Europe we have been naive and short-sighted, because for very long the only just as a very simple example, for the past 15 years across Europe, governments, decision makers have been engaged in trying to build this dialogue with their respective Muslim communities, and not one, communities within Europe. They've been engaging almost exclusively with representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood, because they were the only ones who were organized and able to set up an organization, as opposed to all the different voices within Muslim communities. So that's an indication of major naivete. They have refused, or they haven't been able to engage to all those other individuals within their respective countries who represent a different perspective of Islam. The only interlocutors you've seen on engaging with governments, on TVs, you name them, were extremists. UK, look at what UK has done. But it's not only the UK, it's not about pinpointing one country. That's naivety. There's no formal consultations, obviously, because I'm very glad you guys are still in Brussels. I think we're the last ones, but there's quite a high number of European officials, and we do have extensive meetings over the next few days.
FIFA is a private organization. FIFA makes its own decision based on FIFA's rules. That'll be up to FIFA to decide what it's going to do with that. Individuals, I mean, there's already a lot of pressure on FIFA for its allowing Qatar to host the event. That's a FIFA decision. We're going to have to wait. Let's see if FIFA doesn't. Yeah, for good or bad, I do remain optimistic on most of these things, even when the evidence before us is pretty grim. But I do believe we will see a resolution on this because, again, as we talked about, it's very much in the public. The importance of the situation is out there. Action needs to be taken, and when the action is taken, then we'll start seeing a resolution to the situation. Our biggest concern, as we said before, is long-term action in this regard that is stable, that allows us to keep moving forward. It would be easier if I can just email you the documents that Trends has put together based on our open source intelligence research. What we've shown is that Qatar has a history of working against the global trends and supporting terrorism. We've identified known entities and individuals in Qatar or associated with Qatar who have been sanctioned by UN, US, EU. We've also put together a research policy brief on the sort of destructive language coming out of Al Jazeera, where again, terrorism and extremism has been glorified, has been celebrated in a fairly disgusting way. And we've put together just the facts on that. All this information is in the open source. It is readily available, but we've just put it together in a 2-page document that I said I'm happy to share with anybody in the room. Just provide me with your details and I'll get it emailed to you today.